Now it's time for us to move on to our guest, Joshua Hren, who is the author of a number of books. The primary focus of today's conversation will be this one, How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, a recent, as you can see, pretty darn thick tome that really is a kind of ars poetica of the Catholic imagination today. Joshua takes us through the opportunities and challenges for writing of faith, also takes us through a lot of writers from the great tradition and contemporary writers and how they engage with faith and the supernatural, and the craft of writing. The last section is really focused on the craft of writing and how it relates to the practice of writing today. He's also the author of 2 collections of short stories, This Our Exile and In the Wine Press, of a forthcoming novel, Infinite Regress, coming, I believe, Joshua, in February 2022, right?
Correct.
All right, so I encourage you all to check that out. He's published essays and articles in America Magazine, First Things, Public Discourse, Commonweal, Logos, and I'm just going to say numerous other publications because it's a far too long list to read them all out.
You forgot that I've been published on my mother's refrigerator, which is probably the crowning achievement of my life.
The most important publication source, yes, and his mother's refrigerator. He is also, with the poet James Matthew Wilson, the co-founder of the MFA program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, often a partner of Scala's and the nation's first MFA program in creative writing that works in the Catholic intellectual and literary tradition. And he is the founder and editor-in-chief of Wise Blood Books, an editing and publishing arm that aims, is it fair to say, Joshua, aims to contribute to a Catholic literary renaissance?
That is definitely fair to say. Yeah, not all of the authors that we publish are Catholic, but definitely sort of inhabiting that vein for sure.
All right. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Joshua here today. I have a number of questions for him, and we're going to talk through the content of his new book. And then for those of you on the call, you're going to be invited probably at about 45 minutes in, somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour to sign in with questions. So I'll let you know when that happens. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to you, Joshua, and ask if we can move from biographical information to the real you. I'd like to start these conversations by learning a little bit about our guests. So could you tell us a little bit about where you're from, where you grew up, and how you got from there to where you are today?
Sure, yeah. So I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I basically was raised in a kind of cafeteria Christian household where we were rotating from Pentecostalism to Assembly of God to Catholic Mass on any given Sunday for many years. Both my parents were the youngest of 6, and in most cases, their siblings ended up leaving the Catholic faith. My parents, I think, got pretty close to doing the same as well, but by the time I was 13, they settled into the Catholic faith. And at the very moment that they made that more definitive turn, I left the church. And I left it basically for 3 reasons. One, I was scandalized by the Eucharist. I was actually terrified by the prospect that the Eucharist was real and true, and the church's claims about it were right. And then if that was the case, it really bothered me that we would be eating the body of God. And I asked my parish pastor, who was very generous and I'm sure a wonderful man, but he wasn't St. Thomas Aquinas. And so I had lots of theological questions for him, which I think he wasn't able to answer. And so the combination of those 2 things, and then also in that same year, there was a fellow student at my grade school whose father passed away from cancer, and she was one of only a few African American students in my class. The pastor had basically indicated that because she wasn't able to pay the final semester's tuition, she would have to leave the school. And this happened at the same time that the parish had bought like a $20,000 sign just announcing the name of the parish in the front lawn. And I found this, my adolescent mind basically was totally scandalized at the hypocrisy, and not only scandalized at that particular situation, but I universalized it and imagined that what was happening in my particular parish was the state of the church kind of at large. And so I left the faith for about 7 years, lived a very Augustinian life, and basically returned to the Catholic faith after having been a kind of a syncretist and settling into what I could easily have seen to be a state of permanent questing, a permanent spiritual seeking, where I was pretty comfortable kind of dipping into the I Ching and some Buddhist writings, and then occasionally cracking open the Bible in a kind of carousel mode without any kind of apparent contradictions. But I started getting into debates with one of my coworkers at a dive restaurant that I was working at, waiting tables while basically writing poetry and writing a little bit of fiction as well, but primarily writing poetry at that time. And he was a young Catholic who had a couple of children. And I remember someone telling me that he was a Catholic, and I was grumbling under my breath about having to train him because he was a Catholic. I was actually deeply anti-Catholic at the time. And he and I nonetheless struck up a friendship and would have long debates about the Catholic Church. Long after the restaurant was closed, we'd be sitting outside underneath the street lights having these conversations, and he was basically winning the arguments.
Hated when that happens.
I did too, and I hated it so much that I certainly didn't want him to know that he was winning the arguments. And so I started to sneak away to Mass, which would have been a shameful thing for me to admit to any of my friends at the time. And at every single Mass that I attended, I don't know definitively what was happening, but what I can say is that during the consecration, when the priest lifted up the host, I would lose consciousness for a time. And I can only assume that it was some sort of mystical experience. It convinced me that God is real and particularly manifest in the Eucharist, and by sort of extension in the church. But it took me a long time to kind of get my life in order in a way that really reflected that understanding or that admission. So it wasn't an intellectual or a moral conversion at first. It was much more of a mystical experience. And to get my moral and intellectual house in order took probably another 5 years.
And it was the Eucharist on both sides.
That's a good point.
Eucharist that drove you to leave the church, and something happening with the Eucharist that started to draw you back.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Are you still scandalized by the Eucharist?
Very much so, to the point that, right, I almost feel that I have to receive it every day, because it would be scandalous not in a scrupulous sense, but just if the claims are real, and if this truly is the body of God, and there's a Mass 2 blocks down from my house, what would I be doing if I didn't go? Right? So.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I'd like to connect it to your journey as a writer.
Sure.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got to understand yourself as a writer and start writing? Have you always wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I could probably trace it back to the fact that when I came out of my mother's womb, I had a leather-bound copy of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment under one arm, and I was actually holding a quill pen and just kind of wailing and moaning in this attempt to kind of articulate the human condition.
And Dostoevsky is still watching over your shoulder, quite
He
literally.
is, yeah. Big Brother, the good Big Brother, is always kind of hovering over my shoulder, making sure that I keep on the straight and narrow. He has that, I think you called it a beatific scowl, which is the best articulation I've ever heard. I've only seen one image of him where he looked more peaceful, and that was the picture that was taken on his funeral day when he was arranged, and he probably put a smile on his face. But yeah, so to be serious, I actually started writing, I think, at fourth grade. And I completed my first 96-page novel, which was a kind of spin-off or rip-off of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. I'm convinced that it's probably the best thing that I've ever written, but I can't find it in my mom's attic to this day. I've continued to try to unearth it. And my parents would kind of come into the basement where I'd be writing and forcibly pull me out and make me play outside, because they were concerned that I was getting kind of lost in this unreal world, or, sort of inordinately attached to fiction, in the same way that, say, St. Augustine in his Confessions worries about his own inordinate attachment to theatrical plays, where he becomes kind of more obsessed with what's happening on the stage and more addicted to the emotional experiences that these theatrical plays will give him than he is attentive to the state of his own soul. So I think that there was some maybe combination of misunderstanding on my parents' part, combined with a lot of wisdom, because I was sort of doing, what Don Quixote shows us not to do, which is sort of mistaking the fictional for the real. But it also kind of was my first habituation into the practice. And then I barely graduated high school after having gotten expelled from one Catholic school for founding an underground newspaper. And so I think that's also part of my illustrious writing heritage. And
expelled from a Catholic school for founding an underground newspaper. Tell me a little bit about that.
Or maybe not. I think I could probably tell my confessor a little bit of that under the seal.
Okay.
It's honestly not one of my highest moments. But I basically didn't think that I was college material, and I also was this kind of pseudo self-understood or self-described Marxist reading the Communist Manifesto, and I just thought that college was quote unquote bourgeois, right? And so I worked at a paper factory, kind of doing the Simone Weil thing, where I would see what it's like to kind of enter into those means of production day after day, and then I would come home and try to write poetry and play music. And I did that for a time, and also would participate in these kind of knockdown, drag-out poetry readings at a coffee house. And it really was a kind of old school coffee house that had 2 floors. And the top floor, every Sunday night, would have these 3-hour poetry readings that were basically my kind of secular liturgy. And there I met a lot of poets who were very serious about their craft. They had known members of the Beat Generation. They would do things like, go down to New Mexico and dig ditches in the summer so that they could save up money to come back and write poetry in winter in Milwaukee. And I really admired the genuineness of their pursuit. And I was also, of course, surrounded in the coffee shop by people who were kind of posers and who would talk a lot about being artists, but you would always wonder how they could talk about being artists so much and not actually go home and work on anything, if that makes sense. And so, right, I wanted to make sure not to fall into the latter category. And I think that what ensured that I wouldn't was that I was dating someone at the time. And she was in a creative writing class. She was in college, I wasn't. And she had to work one evening and asked me to write a short story for her, which I did dutifully in a coffee shop, scribbling away on a napkin this story on, literally by candlelight. It was, about as romantic of an image as you could conjure. And she showed it to her
You'll write
professor.
the story to be copied by her, to be submitted under her name. Got it. Okay.
You're absolutely right. So you can tell from the state of my biographical history so far that I'm a morally upstanding citizen of the world.
Yeah.
So basically, my foray into fiction was secured by plagiarism and theft, because she showed it to her professor, and he said, "This is the best thing that anyone's written for me in a long, long time. How did you come up with this? How did you come up with that?" And she kind of had to lie through her teeth. But that convinced me to go to college and to take the life of the mind seriously. And soon thereafter, soon after that, I had the conversion. And so the kind of the intellectual explosion, artistic and creative explosion, and the return to the faith really coincided with one another.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. It's one of the strangest but most striking examples I've ever heard of the power of a really good teacher, or the power of a teacher believing in you. He thought he was believing in your then girlfriend, but it sounds like that sort of enabled you to believe that, oh yeah, people can recognize what I write can mean something to people.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good way of putting it. And I think that in all frankness, I'm sure that it was a combination of vanity, right? Someone actually appreciating my work in that way, and a genuine need for a mentor or a teacher, because I had been writing fervently, feverishly for years and years, on the city bus on the way to and from high school. But this was the first time that someone had kind of recognized it as a genuine talent.
Yeah. Wow. Praise God.
Yes. Amen.
So I want to follow up on something, on the initial question that your parents raised about the sort of seductive fantasy world of the imagination, because I think this is a problem that kind of crops up over and over again. And I'd like your thoughts now, as a sort of considered artist, about the relationship between sort of the way in which the fictional can be a kind of entry into a greater reality, but can also be a temptation to avoid the real.
Sure.
This is something you've continued to think about, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you can think about, Tolstoy's widow in her notes about his life, where she sort of says, no one will ever know the real man behind these morally and spiritually magnificent fictions, the real man who was never willing to sit next to one of our children's beds for even 5 minutes, because he was up there constructing these beautiful scenes that maybe move other people to live morally outstanding or beautiful or spiritually engaged lives. But of course, there is that discrepancy. And so it's a very real, possibility. It's a very real concern. And I would also, cite what George Saunders brings up about the sort of this Renaissance in Russian literature, where he talks about in his book A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, about you have in a very short period of time Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Turgenev, Gogol, and Tolstoy, right, sort of all writing, and then after this 70-year Renaissance, we have, following one of the bloodiest, most irrational periods in human history. And so what this kind of demonstrates, I think, is that beauty, right, will not save the world in any kind of secure or definitive way. It's not as though, right, having those great works produced or having even a broad readership of those works translates into moral and spiritual transformation. But it also would be an exaggeration to say that it cannot produce that transformation. I know for a fact that it does. I can think of, for example, cases where I've taught Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and the class is typically divided among students who sort of say these characters are totally bombastic and unreal and ridiculous, carnivalesque to a point that I can't understand them or relate to them. And then usually after class in the quiet of the hallway, I'll have a student come up to me and say, this actually was able to explain the Brothers Karamazov with all of the family dysfunction and the way in which he enters into the souls of the characters who are grappling with this dysfunction in such very different and conflictual ways. They'll say, this explained my life to me and helped me heal, actually, from my own sort of divorce situation. My family was divorced and there was a lot of drama. Let's say they'll come to me and say, and this really helped me heal from that, right? So yeah, I think it can definitely go both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot that I want to follow up on in what you've just said. It's so rich. I think I'm going to zero in on one thread in particular, though. Your suggestion that beauty will not save the world, because that's one of the more controversial claims that you make, especially in the first part of How to Read and Write Like a Catholic. You have an extended argument about beauty and a sort of critique of the way that a lot of contemporary Catholic and other Christian thinkers think about beauty, right?
Yes.
There's a tendency to quote, it's a line from Dostoevsky, who's just looking down over your shoulder, scowling and saying, well, maybe beauty will save the world. And sort of, it is his, of course, it's not in his voice, it's in the voice of a character, but it is a line from Dostoevsky that people like to cite, that beauty will save the world. And we talk very often, including at Scala and from some of our guests on this webinar series, that beauty will save the world, or of the importance of beauty, I think in really robust and important ways. But you want to push back on that, and you want to say that maybe beauty is not the only or the central value in aesthetics, and that maybe it can't bear the weight in evangelization that some of us want to give it. So maybe could I ask you to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I appreciate your nuanced kind of qualification there, that it's not the only value in aesthetics. And to circle back around to Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, where the phrase appears, another character asks Prince Mishkin, the hero of the novel, right, is it true, Prince, that you said that beauty will save the world? And he sort of hems and haws and doesn't really give a definitive answer. So there's a real hesitation surrounding even the quote when it's introduced in Dostoevsky's novel. But then if they're talking about beauty saving the world in relation to this sort of drop dead beautiful woman named Nastasia Filipovna, and the way that her beauty is experienced by most of the characters in the novel accords more with a kind of sham beauty that Pope Benedict XVI talks about, which is a kind of simulacrum or substitute for a genuine experience with the being of the beautiful. And Nastasia Filipovna, she arrests the hearts of many men and moves a lot of pieces in the novel, but it moves towards her murder, right, and her death. And so, right, so even in the novel itself, I think that beauty will save the world thing doesn't really play out in the way that we talk about it outside of that, taking it out of context. But so then, sort of beyond that, the Pontifical Council for Culture released this document called the Via Pulchritudinis, right, or the Way of Beauty, which, as you say, Scala is very much sort of immersed in and familiar with. And I think that there's a lot of truth to what the document is trying to get across. They say that, the truth in our time has become ideologized. So people don't believe that the truth exists, right, because we live in this sort of post-truth world where, some sort of, I think, even the interesting thing is you have this conjunction between like postmodernist thinkers like Lyotard, who say that there are only ghosts of interpretation out there. There's no truth. And then you have like Donald Trump assistants, campaign assistants who say things like, right, there's really no such thing as truth anymore. There's just what you interpret and what I interpret, and we can't sort of arrive at any kind of definitive facts. I mean, it's a very bizarre sort of confluence from totally divergent political spheres, kind of arriving at the same kind of suspicion of truth. And so the document says truth has been ideologized, the good has been horizontalized. And I think what they mean by that is that, right, sort of the church oftentimes even is understood to be just another organization like any other NGO, where we're just sort of doing good in a humanistic way, but in terms of really embodying the transcendent power of Christian charity, which is distinct from sort of humanitarian sympathy or pity, right? We've sort of lost that sense of the works of mercy, right? High schoolers who are going through their confirmation classes will oftentimes do service projects rather than works of mercy, for example, right? So in a world like that, this document says the way of beauty is a privileged pathway through which we can reach the Augustines of our time. Now, I think that is to a limited degree true, because you have situations like in my old neighborhood where there was this beautiful Polish church, and I remember living there, and this drug addict in the neighborhood walked into the church and was so overcome with the beauty that he actually fell down on the floor, kissed the ground, and eventually ended up converting to the Catholic faith. So this can happen. That the beauty can be this privileged pathway, whereas like if I would have gotten into a theological argument with him, nothing would have happened. But I think it's a kind of incomplete or inadequate characterization of what fiction is and does. So fiction, it does contain beautiful lines, especially in poetry, right? The verses have a beautiful meter, beautiful music. There's a song that's beautiful that pulses throughout it. But if you think about a novel, for example, you have kind of painterly novels like Willa Cather's or Proust's, or Henry James, where there are these extended metaphors or a slowing down of the narrative that gives us a real kind of steeping in the supersaturated beautiful of the cosmos, right? A depiction of the moon that goes on for a paragraph or something like that, right? While, in other words, they're not just focused on plot and action, but they are also, fiction and novels are also concerned with truth and goodness, right? And so as John Henry Newman says, fiction should teach us how to take things as they are, not as we would want them to be, right? So he says it with this kind of sober, almost Hobbesian kind of political realism. It sounds like, I don't think he means it quite to be that severe, but he basically says that fiction teaches us to see that the history of humankind is mainly a record of man in rebellion. And if we're just thinking about literature is about beauty and beautiful souls and beauty, 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 we kind of miss that, right? So literature can be justified on other grounds as well. The goodness of literature can be justified on other grounds as well.
Okay, wow, there's so much there. So let me see if I've got this. So truth becomes ideologized, and so it becomes used as a weapon. We're not actually talking with one another so much, but are using truth claims very often, which are interpretations, to sort of declare that we're right or to try to sort of win a battle. The good becomes horizontalized, which I take you to be saying that doing good becomes simply addressing someone's material concerns, which is important, but is not the wholeness of the good.
Right.
And that's where the church becomes sort of another NGO. Its work isn't seen as different from that of a non-religious charitable organization.
Sure, yeah.
Beauty can bypass these things. It is possible for beauty to, or it's maybe in our cultural moment easier for an experience of the beautiful, for walking into a beautiful church, or maybe even seeing a sort of morally beautiful act, an act of sacrifice or love,
Right.
to reveal the presence of God more directly or clearly than we might see in an act of truth or goodness at this moment.
Yeah.
But beauty is nevertheless not the only way that we see God's presence.
That's
And
right.
in particular, in a work of literary art, it is not the only quality or the only thing that the artist is trying to render.
Yeah, no, and so, yeah, that's very, very much fair. And so, in How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, I basically kind of tried to swing back and forth across that pendulum of, Dante's Divine Comedy, which takes us towards the fullness of beauty in in our participation in the beatific vision, which he describes as this kind of mystical rose, and the souls that are inhabiting that mystical rose are presented as bees that are flying from petal to petal, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have Newman's kind of man as a record of man largely in rebellion. And just to tease that out a little bit more, the goods that can come from encountering that rebellion bear some kind of justification. Because I think a lot of times in Christian and Catholic circles, there can be this kind of sense of scandal that comes about from reading a lot of literature, right? Because people want there to be uplift, instant uplift, as Flannery O'Connor would call it. Or there's this sense that, as Tolkien describes, fantasy providing this kind of eucatastrophe when everything seems to be going wrong, then all of a sudden there's a moment of grace, and in spite of the fact that all the other hobbits die, right, Sam and Frodo are kept alive, right? And I love The Lord of the Rings, by the way. I wrote a book on Tolkien, so I'm not trying to disparage that, but I do think that there is a problem with arguing that every single story written by a Christian or every story that a Christian can appreciate needs to have that kind of upward tilt or turn at the end. And I think that one way of arguing the counter is to appreciate the goods that can only come from tragedy, right? Mm-hmm. So take one of the chapters I devote to Chekhov's story, The Bishop, where we have this kind of aged bishop who's in love with the liturgy, and Chekhov really gives us these extraordinarily beautiful passages describing the candles and the rituals that go into the divine liturgy. But this bishop who's in love with the liturgy is approached on his sort of sickbed by his niece, whose family is in a dire situation and they need money. And the bishop keeps saying, right, sort of, I'll give it to you tomorrow. Don't worry, I'll help you soon. And he keeps saying that, she keeps visiting, and then eventually the bishop dies before he actually does this act of charity. And so, right, let's say that we tried to rewrite that tale and make it quote unquote Christianese, right? That would mean that the bishop would have to give the girl the money on the last page, right, as he was dying and going out of this world. Why is it good that he didn't do that? It's good that he didn't do that because we need to see the consequences of a sustained habituation into sin play out on the pages so that we can see, by analogy, our own proclivity to do the same thing, to neglect, right, others who need us. And this dispels the illusion that we can have in our own minds that there will always be a tomorrow, or I'll always have an opportunity to do this next week, next year, etc. And so that's the power of tragedy, right? We in real life, we wouldn't want this to play out in the same way, but on fiction, it's really important that King Lear and his family, right, sort of have all of these dysfunctions, because then we say, well, after I watch King Lear, I'm a better parent for at least 4 days, right? Because it motivates me to not want to have a family dynamic that is similar to that of Lear and his children, his daughters.
Wow. Yeah, that's so what I'm hearing, among other things, is you should read King Lear every 4 days. Um, that sounds like an extraordinarily grueling thing to do, as wonderful as that play is. But yeah, there is the novel, maybe the novel in particular, or sort of narrative art, as opposed to something like lyric poetry, is especially oriented towards the tragic or the mundane or those things um, through which we sort of see God's presence by its negative reflection, by the sort of the reflection in its absence.
Yes.
It sounds like you're saying that in the Chekhov story, and I think in a lot of literature, the failure to make an act, a morally good act, an act of love, makes the love register somehow more strongly than if it happened in the story.
That's I absolutely agree with that. Yes.
All right, thank you. And that really takes us nicely to the next topic that I want to talk about, which is literature itself and the way in which specifically writers of faith understand themselves today. To sort of move into our moment, we've been talking all over the place about Dostoevsky, about Chekhov, about George Saunders, about a whole bunch of writers, about Joshua's own work, of course, but a whole host of writers from past and present. And I want to think specifically about Catholic and other Christian writers, because I think that Joshua is part of the center of a new movement in Catholic writing. And I think it would be useful to sort of sketch out how we got to where we are and to have some conversation about how both of us understand this moment in writing and what its potentials are. And then maybe we'll move over to questions. And I hope that a bunch of our participants will also chime in and ask some questions about where we are in Catholic literature. So to bring us up to the present, I think most people who follow Catholic and Christian fiction think of the early to mid 20th century as a kind of period of a lot of activity. You've got your Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy and Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh and John Updike and a whole host of writers who identified in a very serious way as believing Christians, sort of coming from maybe different points and poles within the Christian tradition, but making a serious believing voice present in the literature of the English language. That it was sort of hard to avoid Catholicism, especially in the 50s and 60s in literature. It was certainly not the only or the dominant voice, but it was a vital one. Is that fair to say, Joshua?
I agree, yes.
And then there seems to have been some transformations, a sort of shift from O'Connor and Percy, who maybe made a more full-throated Christian presentation, to a generation or two of writers who spoke more in the still small voice, or for whom the representation of faith, the representation of God's action is more muted. And eventually you get up to a point in the early 2010s when you have a couple of essays that shake up the landscape by more or less saying, what happened to all the believers? There's an essay in the New York Times called Has Fiction Lost Its Faith? By Paul Ely, and that's 2012. And then in 2013, there's a much more extensive essay in First Things by Dana Gioia called The Catholic Writer Today, both of which in somewhat different ways speak about a felt absence of religious concerns, of questions of faith, of narratives and dynamics of faith, and in the case of the Gioia essay, specifically of a Catholic voice in literary culture. And that happened 8 or 9 years ago. And since then, there seems to have been a new generation, especially in the last few years, a new generation of writers emerge. Joshua is a part of that new generation. Some other figures that come to mind for me would be James Matthew Wilson, Christopher Beha, Kirsten Valdez Quaid, Phil Clay, Katie Carl. I could go on and name a bunch more, but those are people who I think would jump to most people's minds as voices in this kind of new moment in particularly Catholic literary production and imagination. So far, Joshua, this sort of checks out with your sense of what's happened?
It resonates very well. I think you're articulating it very precisely. Yeah.
Okay. So then I'm going to turn it over to you and maybe ask, what is your take on, I'll leave you with a pretty broad question on how we got here, and then of what's distinctive about this new generation of writers. What are they doing?
Yeah, right. So to back up just a little bit to the sort of generation just prior to Christopher Beha, Phil Clay, and others who are working in that part of the literary vineyard, you have writers, very gifted writers, marvelous writers like Alice McDermott and Ron Hansen, and their approach to rendering experiences of religiosity or faith kind of takes a couple of different shapes that I think are important to acknowledge or document. On the one hand, they get away with narrating religious experience by setting their novels in the more distant past, so 1930s New York or late 19th century upstate New York, right? Or these kinds of, sort of the basically the mode there, or the tacit argument would be, well, it's okay for these characters to be having these religious experiences or to be tethered to the Catholic Church in the way that they are, because that was happening in the historical past. And it's a historicist kind of argument that would then suggest by implication that we kind of really can't set any stories in the present moment where characters are having that level of full-blooded religious experience anymore, right?
So someone like Carolyn Robinson, coming from the Protestant tradition, right, arguably the most visible avowedly Christian novelist writing today, is working in a kind of similar mode, right? It's the Gilead novel set in from the 19th century up to 1956, but not today.
Yes, and then you have, right, in kind of part and parcel with that literary generation, which is kind of happening in the rough time period of postmodernity, is very much this kind of capitulation to, or at least accommodation of, a kind of skepticism and relativism with regards to belief. So I think of especially a very lyrically beautiful novel like Marriott in Ecstasy by Ron Hansen, where you have this young nun, and you can never really tell by the last page whether she's having a genuine religious experience or whether she's kind of deluded, right? And he intentionally kind of leaves it so that this either or is put, the burden of resolving it is put on the reader's shoulders. And there's nothing kind of innately wrong with that. But I think what you see in this new generation of writers is a kind of a movement beyond that accommodation of skepticism and relativism to that degree. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We have in Christopher Beha's What Happened to Sophie Wilder, which was published in about 2013. There's a real kind of dramatization and full-throated, full-blooded kind of articulation of both faith and doubt. And so what we see is a movement beyond this kind of trope of having faith be belief that is sort of maybe a projection and maybe real. You have faith being presented as really real, and doubt being presented as also somewhat compelling and something that the character has to face, countenance, wrestle with. And sometimes the character is undone by that staring into the abyss of doubt, right? So in Sophie Wilder, the titular character, Sophie, is taking care of her father-in-law in spite of the fact, his name is Crane, excuse me, in spite of the fact that her husband has left her for this law office intern. She has taken to caring for Crane in his dying days. He is racked with pain. He asks her to basically give him an overdose of pain medication. She initially resists, and Beha dramatizes this beautiful kind of work of Christian mercy. And you sense that the only reason she's at her bedside is that she has had this conversion to the Catholic faith. And the conversion that she had is described in something like these words: God occupied her, right? It's not just like she had this sort of hint or whisper of a sort of transcendent being or something. God and the God of Christianity sort of inhabited her, occupied her. And I'm going to point to a passage in Phil Clay's novel where something similar happens. This is a sort of subplot within Missionaries, his most recent novel, and he didn't win the National Book Award for it, but it was named, a notable New York Times book. It's on reading lists like President Obama's reading list, right? So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that this is someone who a lot of people are reading, and it's important to note that in a novel that a lot of people are reading, there's a plot thread that's devoted to a kind of religious conversion, and there's a character named Valencia who becomes fascinated with a kind of Christian outreach she's motivated by Christian concerns to work among the poor in Colombia, where she already lives, but in a region called Notre de Santander. And her father sort of warns her against going there, that she's going to be, get into bad company with a drug lord. And she sort of repudiates all of his good advice. He actually ends up being right. And she gets into a position of severe danger. Her life is almost lost. And then Phil Clay gives us the following line. As she her life breath is going out of her, she begins to pray. And he says, God, if there was a God, reached into Valencia's body and squeezed her lungs with his large hands and ran his fingers down her nerves and breathed hot breath over her eyes. And he tapped her heart once, then twice, as the blood rushed and drained and rushed and drained through her. And then he drew back, leaving a hole behind where the air rushed in, right? So, yeah, so what you're seeing here, this is undeniably a narration of not just any God, but Christ. It's an incarnate God. He has fingers. He runs his fingers down her nerves to revive her. It's a very beautiful passage.
And it's a bizarre passage. It makes me shiver, but it's a bizarre passage because it begins, God, if there is a God, and then tells you what that God, if there is a God, does. But is there an option left open for if there isn't a God? Then what's happening here?
That's right. That's exactly
it's a very strange and I think bold play with what it means to talk about God's action. That there is, I suppose, if you want to say that, well, if there isn't a God, then there is just kind of some weird experience going on inside of her. But really, the narrative, it introduces that question of doubt in order to depict something that is very hard to make sense of if you do not choose the option of belief.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so, the novel is definitely taken as a whole, steeped in a kind of mood of doubt, I will say, and that's an important kind of qualification. And it reminds me of what Pope Benedict says in Introduction to Christianity about Christians sort of in the modern world really inhabiting a culture of doubt. And so they can't help but be surrounded by it and maybe even absorb some of its power. But from within that sort of position of doubt, it might seem, he says, as though we're sort of subscribing to this ancient relic of the past, almost like you just walked out of an Egyptian sarcophagus into New York City, and you're coming with all these kind of hieroglyphics of faith that no one really understands. But I think something like that passage from Clay is sort of defying the idea that it needs to be left on the hieroglyphic level. It can be made articulate in a way that's compelling.
Oh, it does not need to be left on the hieroglyphic level. I love that way of putting it, that there is, faith does not need to be left as either a sort of cultural remnant or something that is an option we used to have, or a sort of option that can be presented purely as an option. So that would be the Mariette and Ecstasy approach.
Right.
Mariette and Ecstasy is one of my favorite novels as well. There was this beautiful story by Ron Hansen about I believe, early 20th century French-Canadian nun in New York who receives the stigmata, but doesn't receive them visibly and receives them mystically. So she believes that she is sharing the wounds of Christ, and she experiences suffering. And that story is played out. Her fellow nuns and other people in the novel try to figure out whether this is really happening or whether she's just having some sort of weird mental event.
Right.
And Hansen never really answers the question for us. He keeps both possibilities all alive all the way through in a way that feels like a kind of a claim of legitimacy that, well, we can take seriously, we can sort of talk about mystical experiences because we take seriously the possibility that they're not real.
Right.
And also as a way for someone who doesn't share Hansen's faith to enter into the narrative.
That's right.
It seems as though maybe the new generation of writers is a little less apologetic.
I think that's fair to say. So, I mean, I'll cite one story from my first collection, This Our Exile, where I'm taking up a sort of a similar theme or religious experience. It's called Sacre Coeur, and there's a young woman who has been obsessed with reading the biography or autobiography of Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque, right, who received the sort of the devotion of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, this kind of, right, overwhelmingly grotesque but sacredly very rich sort of image of God. And she's a daughter of divorced parents. Her mother hands her condoms and encourages her to try out the boys that she's interested in having relationships with first in the bedroom before they get more serious, right? So her mother is sort of totally kind of post-Christian. Her dad is a little bit more open to the faith, but neither of her parents really know what to do with her sudden kind of obsession with St. Margaret Mary. And the mom actually accuses the dad of getting the book for her and allowing her to read it. And she thinks that this is doing psychological damage to her because there are these marks on the girl's body. And the mother is convinced that she's been cutting herself, right, in sort of self-harm. But the story much more, it tilts much more towards the probability that this is a kind of genuine religious experience. And just like Margaret Mary's sort of, literally bending down and touching with her tongue the wounds of those that she was repulsed by, right? This is a kind of aspect of the faith that ought to be preserved in the present moment, that there's something kind of perpetually scandalous about the demands that Christ sort of puts on us, right? So it's the story again attempts to render it in such a way that it can't be reduced to the kind of maybe this is a projection or this is probably more likely a projection or right. So the characters themselves, the mom herself, tries to take that as a kind of way out to wash her hands of it, right? But the story kind of ironically treats the mother for doing that, if that makes sense.
It does, and it seems like it also gets at something else that might be distinctive about the current generation, which is the sense of rebelliousness about the decision to believe in a serious religious or Christian tradition. That there's almost a kind of statement of, look, I'm here too, to, I think, recent believing fiction, where 50 years ago, the rebellion was all on the side of leaving the church, or leaving the practice of organized religion. Today, there's a feeling of rebellion about a young person's decision to go back to church or to go to church for the first time. Or there very often, not that this is true of everyone, but there very often can be. And there is a kind of, in narrative art, there is this need to say, well, no, not all the stories are about people being raised Christian and then leaving. Some of them are about being raised, I guess, in this space, kind of not really religiously anything.
Nothing, yeah, none.
Yeah. And then discovering the living presence of the living God.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Thank you.
And I should mention, right, there's actually this wonderful passage in Christopher Beha's What Happened to Sophie Wilder, where one of the characters openly muses, who converts anymore? If anyone's doing any converting, they're converting out of the church, which is doubly a wonderful sort of ironic remark, because Beha himself had not returned to the church when he was writing What Happened to Sophie Wilder. And so that's, we don't have time to get into that today, but it's another aspect that I try to treat in How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, that the Catholic imagination can extend beyond, right, writers who are sort of consciously committed Catholics, right? Because sometimes, and oftentimes, I think, a great writer will work out a lot of these most deeply felt and thought through concerns about religion, even if they aren't a believer themselves, right? They'll work them out by writing it through the novel, right? If that makes sense.
Absolutely. So now I would like to turn over to the Q&A. We've got a few questions already up in the Q&A, and I'd like to ask our participants, if you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A, and I'm going to share these with Joshua. I'm going to start with one that is up here already. We've got a participant who asks, can the Catholic literary imagination be dependent on the particularities of one's culture? For instance, is the American Catholic literary imaginary distinct from a Japanese or Asian one? And so I guess this ties in with what we've been saying about the historical moments or historical trajectories in the Catholic literary imagination, in which it might be different in 2021 than it was in 1961. Similarly, it might be different in this example, Japan, in China, or in France, or in other places, or even in regions within the United States. It's often remarked that there was a distinctively Southern Catholic literary imagination in the mid-century, of which O'Connor and Percy were sort of the primary representatives, but also you had figures like Alan Tate and Carolyn Gordon. So I guess the question is asking you to think about the relationship between the Catholic literary imagination. Catholic means universal. It is how God comes to and saves man, with the particular, specific, historically grounded and local imagination.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and I would say that, right, you're right to point out the universality of the Catholic Church and also the Catholic imagination, but what we mean when we talk about that needs to be kind of qualified, because it's not like this abstract or floating kind of Platonic Catholic imagination that is sort of hovering over the face of the earth, and all over the world people are just sort of, plucking little pieces of it and dropping it into a book. So I think of, for example, Shisako Endo's Silence, And, there's a way in which that novel is positively Japanese in that he probes, the question of Catholicism's sort of success or seemingly kind of overwhelmingly doomed failure in Japanese culture to kind of be sustained or take root. But it's also very much a kind of a Jesuitical novel, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is that, right, it just deals with these larger questions that the church has always had to face about missionary activity and how you enculturate and the limits to enculturation, right? And so I think that it would be an error to kind of overemphasize the Japanese quality, if that makes sense. Just like it would be an error to overemphasize the Southern Gothic quality of Carolyn Gordon's novels or of Flannery O'Connor's at the expense of what they're doing to just sort of not use the Southern grotesque, but the grotesque writ largely of kind of imaging man's kind of essential disfigurement, if that makes sense, right? So there's the particular Gothic way of doing that, but when O'Connor does it best, it's with all of the as William Lynch has it in Christ and Apollo. She does it, and Shusaku Endo does it with all of the kind of tang and density of the cultural mores and the real, but not remaining in those particulars of the cultural mores. Because if you go too far in that direction, I think then you have a sort of an emphasis on kind of fragmentation and historically and culturally specific sort of ways of experiencing God that are kind of not accessible to anyone outside of that culture or something like that, which I would sort of rebel against. And, Zadie Smith would too, by the way. But yeah.
Okay, yeah. So there's a maybe sort of grounded real Catholic literature is a mean between opposed vices. Makes it
and I just one other qualification or just clarification I'd raise is that in all of those novels there's a concern with the salvation or the damnation of the characters, right?
Yes.
That happens, right, sort of across the Catholic imagination, but in terms of why their salvation is imperiled, right, then that's going to be modified based on the particular circumstances. And the novel is distinct from something like an epic, which Bakhtin talks about as having like this sort of timeless quality of the past, right, sort of ossified or solidified in it. Whereas the novel, one of the real merits of it is that it deals with the new, right? And so, yeah, I do think that the way that Christopher Beha is going to dramatize questions of faith is going to look different than the way that Flannery O'Connor did. And there's the part of the reason for that is that just there have been massive changes in our cultural mores and norms between those two writers.
Absolutely. Thank you. So there are a couple of questions here. I think, Joshua, I'm going to ask you to put on your teacher's hat for a moment. So there are a couple of questions here about teaching literature, both introducing books to teenagers. Two questions here specifically about children and teenagers and Catholic literature. So partly that is a matter of, we've got a questioner who's asking about being in a mixed marriage and introducing literature to children when the spouse is skeptical of the Catholic Church. There's also a question here about kids not reading like they used to, and how, and I'd really like your thoughts on how to encourage teenagers, children, to engage with literature when they don't have, I guess when you were a kid, you tried to escape from the world and wrote constantly. Your parents tried to kick you out. But I think there is a kind of disconnect between the literature that's out there and young people today. So I guess I'm asking you to speculate a bit about how to get students reading?
I mean, I think you're raising, this is a great question, and it's really tied up with a vice that St. Thomas Aquinas characterizes as curiositas, right? This sort of roaming unrest of the spirit, this kind of sloth that actually takes the form not of like sitting passed out after having drank a six-pack on the couch, but rather just sort of like this interior restlessness of constantly having sort of new sort of sights that you can see in really sort of short sound bites, or right. So the possibility of having infinite possibilities is actually overwhelming, and it makes us sometimes kind of near despair over both our own souls and those of our children. And interestingly, when I was at an in-service for professors a couple years ago, there was a woman who was talking about the I generation, and she was saying that, we have to kind of modify our lesson plans because their attention spans are about 40 seconds at best and veering fast towards more like 8 seconds a piece, right? And so I sort of respectfully asked if this woman could help me figure out how to reduce the Iliad to an 8-second attention span, right? I guess that's another way of saying the next day in class, I told the students outright, I've been told by the experts that you are incapable of developing an attention span beyond 8 seconds. I'd like to believe that that's an insult, and that you can prove me to be wrong by not just reading Spark Notes or Schmoop commentary on the Iliad, but by reading it, right? Now, to be fair, right, to accommodate... Well, right. To be fair, to accommodate the difficulty of the moment where students who showed up in that class, even though it was a college class, oftentimes were half literate, right? I mean, then what you have to do is sometimes make the choice of favoring slow and careful reading over trying to fit everything in the anthology in the semester. So if you want people to regain their attention spans, then we need to devote, let's say, 5 weeks to the Iliad, so that students have time to kind of commit to it and read it instead of trying to fit it into 1 week. I would also say that, part of responding to the other question about the mixed marriage situation, one of the things about the Catholic approach to literature, as Newman has it, is that it's unflinchingly kind of receptive of all natural goods, even those way outside of the Catholic orbit or the Catholic imagination. So, right, read Homer to your kids. I mean, and there are a lot of goods that can come from reading Homer and studying on the natural level his depictions of vices and virtues. And I would also say that, right, I encourage you to read something like Don Quixote to your children together. Reading together as a family, it's challenging, it's hard. I oftentimes fail to do it when I'm really wiped out and exhausted. But when I do it, you can kind of develop this habit where you and your kids know that at 7 p.m., right, rain or shine, exhaustion or no exhaustion, you're going to be sitting down on the couch together with Don Quixote. And part of it is the joy that comes from laughing out loud together at what he's up to, right? Burning the books, right, etc. I mean, my kids were in stitches over that. But for younger children, I would also say that the Catholic imagination that's worth sort of sharing with them comes from Oscar Wilde and his collections of short stories.
Oh, yeah, the Selfish Giant and the fairy tales. Oh, those are fantastic.
Yeah, there's this wonderful story, in addition to the ones that you just said, right, called The Remarkable Rocket, where I think the rocket sort of talks to one of the other firecrackers, and he says, why are you so self-absorbed? You should be thinking about others. And then the other sort of firecracker says, well, okay, what should I be doing? Thinking about who? And he says, you should be thinking about me, right? You should be thinking about others. You should be thinking about me, right? And that's become sort of like a joke in our household, like a mantra. Whenever somebody gets too big for their britches, we remember the remarkable rocket, right? So, I love it. And Oscar Wilde stories are great because they're those perfect kind of children's stories where the parent knows that they're going to have to read this to the child 70 times, 7 times. And if it's a bad children's story, you're going to be sick of it and your kid's going to ask for more of it. But with Oscar Wilde, it's actually really good as an adult to read it more and more and more and more. Right?
So when your kid demands it 70 times over, you're actually not so sorry.
That's right. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, it is certainly deeply in keeping with the Catholic and more broadly Christian intellectual and imaginative tradition that the works of the great pagans are formative for the church and are formative for Christians. That all through the ancient and medieval period, educated Christians read the Aeneid, for instance. Augustine, admittedly, was a little chary about the Aeneid, but it seems like the mind of the church came round to the position that it was a wonderful way of forming young students for the gospel.
Well, right, and I mean the way that I love looking at the very different ways in which Augustine engaged with Virgil and the Aeneid, and the way that Dante engages with Virgil and the Aeneid. It's very different, and but both of them there are, I think, partial goods or partial truths that come from both of them, because Augustine was wary to be. He was right to be critical about the fact that these gods who were doing all these immoral things were being held up as moral exemplars, right? But he was also maybe wrong to heavy-handedly throw out the baby with the bathwater, and Dante sort of gave the necessary corrective.
Absolutely. I also want to speak a little bit to, I loved that response to the claim that, well, we can't teach the Iliad because students have these very short attention spans. It reminds me, one, of a favorite book here at Scala, Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, and the kind of critique of the way in which our attentions get fractured and drawn in so many ways. But it's also the response that you gave, Joshua, is the response of someone who believes that human beings are ensouled beings with free will.
Yeah.
That there's a kind of mentality out there today that we all have these smartphones and we have laptops and there are screens all over the place, and it's just inevitable that we're going to lose print and literary culture, and attention spans are just going to be shorter. That's just the natural way of things. And that's, I think, a very materialist way of looking at things, as this kind of inevitable approach. Whereas if we genuinely believe that human beings are free and are spirit as well as matter, and sort of this combination of spirit and matter that is free because it expresses the freedom of God,
yes,
then students, young readers, have the capacity, have every bit as much capacity as they once had to read Dante or the Odyssey. And what you say, Joshua, about sort of challenging students is appealing to their most human side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, Aristotle talks about at the end of Nicomachean Ethics, what would a world totally without shame look like, right? It would be totally unreformable. And I think that, using a little bit of an appeal to shame for students and saying, like, that's not really true, right? You're not really only capable of an 8-second attention span. I don't think that there's any harm, and there's only good that can be done from that, because, right, young people are innately, especially attracted to great souledness, right? They are wanting to live a life that has some sort of grandeur, or sort of greatness that's possible in it. Now, to be fair, I do think that people who are tracking the sort of decline in reading of novels over the last 50 years are right. The National Endowment of the Arts has done studies that have demonstrated, especially in the last 15 years, a dramatic decrease in adult Americans who are even reading, let's say, one work of fiction, serious fiction, per year, right? That has tanked. And so it's possible that we are kind of on the cusp of a kind of new dark age. I don't know. But if that is the case, right, the worst possible response that we could have is to just sort of throw up our hands and welcome the barbarians, right? In this sort of passive, sort of fate-driven kind of mentality that you're describing. And, I love the way that you describe students as having souls. It reminds me of one of my colleagues at the University of St. Thomas puts it in our attempts to kind of refurbish the core and the reaching out of liberal arts to, undergraduates of all stripes, even if they're just there for a career. He says, right, our students have souls. We have to show them that they have souls, and we have to show them how to use their souls, right?
Yeah.
So
I love that. Yes, that's so true. And it's that appeal to the desire for great souledness. Students want meaning. They want to live meaningful lives, and there is in them. I mean, students, like all human beings, have myriad and conflicted desires. They also want to sleep till 11 and eat all pizza, but they want to do great things. And they're looking for the great things that are out there to be done. I think this is a theme that Scala tends to return to, that students are looking for meaning and purpose. And it falls to education to show them the truly great and inspiring purposes that they could devote their lives to. And that something like the student mental health crisis that we're seeing right now can be in substantial part attributed to the fact that we are failing to show those great and dramatic and important purposes to which students can devote their lives.
I think that's right. I mean, and there's no way in which I'm going to make a full-fledged kind of utilitarian argument about the importance of literature and actually literally addressing the mental health crisis. And what I mean by that is that it could actually help ameliorate some mental health difficulties to read fiction. I'm not going to push that line of argumentation too far, but I think, William Carlos Williams in that poem where he says something like, right, I long to bring you news, right, and I can't sort of convince you that what's happening in literature and poetry is the most relevant or the most timely, but people perish every day for lack of having read poetry, right? And so people are perishing all over the place for having not passed through Shakespeare, Homer, Christopher Bale, Flannery O'Connor, right? I mean, people are perishing all over the place for having sort of replaced those with shallow simulacrums and sort of, what David Foster Wallace calls kind of special treats of Netflix series that are good in small amounts, but they're not meant to be nutritive staples, So.
Absolutely. All right, so we are coming near the end, so I think I'm going to pass on one last question to you, Joshua, from our Q&A that I really like. We've got a participant who asks, are there any future works from Joshua that we can look forward to? How to Read and Write Like a Catholic is a great book. I hope you'll tell us a little bit about Infinite Regress, which is coming up, as much as you want to. I understand the book's not out yet. And then anything else that we should look forward to in the future.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're familiar with Lincoln's second inaugural address, but basically Infinite Regress is for the Catholic literary tradition what Lincoln's second inaugural address was for American history. No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding.
Oh, okay. So there is no honesty in this damn artistic claim.
I clearly need to go read Oscar Wilde's The Remarkable Rocket again. No, the Infinite Regress is basically a family saga that tracks the life of Blake Yorick, who is a young man who's racked with student debt. He's convinced of these kind of, totally inhumane theories, these very ideologically dangerous theories that his professor has bequeathed to him. And he is convinced of them, but he doesn't know how to live his life. And so he's in a squeezed situation of needing to pay off his student loans. he goes to the Bakken oil fields and does some fracking work in North Dakota before that fails miserably when he's nearly killed by someone at knife point. And he comes kind of unwittingly, against his will almost, eventually back home to Milwaukee, where his family catches word of his dire straits and tries to harness all of their efforts to assist him. And they know that he's about to do something really immoral and dangerous in order to get some money. They don't know exactly what it is. And so the brother, the sister, and the father all kind of rally their resources to try to come to his aid. Now, the long story short is that they do end up coming to his aid, but they come tragically too late, right? So it is a story of reconciliation of a kind, but it comes only after some severe costs have had to be paid. The most significant reconciliation that happens is between the son, Blake York, and his father, Garrett York, who at the beginning of the novel is basically a totally inundated alcoholic who sends his daughter to run his errands for him, whether it be mailing letters or getting groceries. And he's just completely inured in drink after because his wife has recently died of a combination of Lyme disease and MRSA. And so the father, who begins the novel in this state of total inebriation and sort of emasculation and checked outedness, ends up being moved by his son's kind of imperiled situation to get his own life together, and also to work towards some kind of reconciliation with his son, however tenuous it is.
Okay, so I hear glimmerings of Brideshead Revisited in the background, in the way in which it's a story of the salvation of characters, but a salvation that comes only through suffering and catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that is an accurate characterization. And I think the mantra is probably Dostoevsky's line about his faith having had to pass through the furnace of suffering and doubt, right? So his hallelujah, he says he's able to say his hallelujah, but only because it's been sort of purified through the fires of suffering and doubt.
Okay, well, Joshua, on that, thank you very much. I am super excited for the book. Infinite Regress comes out in February 2022. Please keep your eyes out for it. In the meantime, Eric, if you would share the link to the Scala Foundation website in the chat as well, I'd encourage you, all of you participating in the call, to check out the Scala website, sign up for our newsletter, and also keep yourself apprised of the other things that we have going on. As I mentioned at the start of the call, we've got a wonderful conference coming up in April on art, the sacred, and the common good. We've got webinars. We've got a masterclass in poetry, which will be hosted by Joshua's colleague, James Matthew Wilson, for which gifted young writers can apply. We've got more webinars coming up. We've got a podcast coming up at some point. We've got a whole host of things. There's new content coming out every day, so please sign up for our newsletters and follow the exciting things coming out of the Scala Foundation and also out of the University of St. Thomas in Houston and off of the desk of one Joshua Hren. Thank you all very much.
I'm so grateful for this conversation, Bill. It was a huge blessing. Thank you.
Indeed, likewise. God bless you all.